South Carolina's Shane Beamer has a ton of pressure to win this year's matchup against Texas A&M, as do the Aggies head coach Mike Elko. But which head coach has more pressure on them? We'll touch on that and a lot more on today's crossover edition between the Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Aggies podcasts.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Before we get into today's crossover show, I want to make sure that y'all know that today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team, both faster and for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Now, on with the show. Welcome on into this crossover edition between the Locked On Gamecocks and the Locked On Aggies podcast, where we cover your respective team every single day. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, and I'm pleased to be joined by Andrew Stefaniak, the host of Locked On Aggies, as we will talk about South Carolina's big-time matchup with the Texas A&M Aggies that's going to take place later this fall, the pressure that's going to be on both coaches, so on and so forth. Andrew, how are you doing today, man?
I'm good. It's been a long time. I'm doing good. It feels like we're starting to get closer to football season, even though we really aren't. But you know what I mean? It feels like we're getting there.
No, yeah, we're definitely in the midst of talking season. You know, we're trying to find things to talk about, and it's never too early to look ahead when it comes to college football. And when it comes to this game between South Carolina and Texas A&M, Andrew, you and I have talked about this in the past. This has always been a bit of a weird game for both teams because there was no history between both these programs prior to Texas A&M joining the league, 12, 13 years ago. And quite frankly, it's never really a game where these teams really circle on the calendar, but I kind of think that that's actually going to be a little bit different this year for both head coaches, and I think that there's pressure on both coaches to win this specific matchup. And so what I kind of want to do, Andrew, to start off this show, I think it's fair to say you're going to say Mike Elko's got more pressure, and I'm going to say Shane Beamer's got more pressure. But why is that the case? I'm going to let you take the floor here. Tell us why Mike Elko has more pressure than Shane Beamer to win this game against South Carolina.
Well, it's funny. I definitely do, and I'll let you explain your side, but we all know Beamer's got some pressure on his end too there for sure. But for Elko, I don't think it's obviously not your job's going to be in trouble pressure. We know that. Like, it's his first year. He's not going anywhere. But this is the type of football game Jimbo Fisher could not win on the road. Like, the number, they had lost something like 847 million games in a row on the road. It was like around there, I think. But all kidding aside, like, they couldn't win on the road. You have to win football games on the road to succeed. 7-5, 8-4 with all this talent that Texas A&M has on a year-to-year basis is not going to get the job done. Eventually, you got to do something special. You got to make a 12-team playoff. You got to make an SEC championship run. You got to do something. And I don't think the expectation for Elko this year is to do that. But this, obviously South Carolina fans haven't seen Texas A&M's schedule more than likely, but it's pretty favorable knowing that your four most challenging games are at home: Notre Dame, LSU, Missouri, and of course Texas. The rivalry's back between the Aggies and the Longhorns. You go on the road, you still have challenging games. South Carolina, you got to go to Auburn, you got to go to Florida. But those games compared to the ones that are at home are, so if you want to win 9 football games, you got to take care of business on the road against some of these, these ranked 12 to 16 teams in the SEC, the 11 in that range, those teams. And so I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Mike Elko in this football game. I think it's pretty even, knowing that, I don't know. It's hard to argue that Elko has a ton more pressure, knowing that Beamer could be, coaching for a job at this point if they struggle this year. But yeah, I definitely think that there's going to be pressure on Elko.
Yeah, no, Andrew, I think you make a lot of great points there as far as Mike Elko and the pressure he has on him. I think Aggie fans are definitely sick and tired of hearing, about how, you're just an 8-win program. You have the money and resources of, an elite program, but you always do less with more. I think that they're sick of that narrative. And Mike Elko, he's been brought in because Jimbo obviously could not get past that. He could not change that. So obviously winning games against South Carolina, from a perception standpoint on the road, definitely see where you're coming from in that regard. Now, as far as Shane Beamer, I think this one's pretty clear for Shane. South Carolina went 5-7, 2023, missed out on a ball game for the first time in Beamer's tenure. I do think that some people, nationally speaking, have kind of jumped the gun a little bit regarding the conversation surrounding Shane Beamer's job security. I would not say that, this is a, boomer bust type year as far as his job's concerned, but I do definitely think that this is a game where if you're Shane Beamer, I think you're going to have to win this game because you look at South Carolina's schedule, and let's go ahead and get this out of the way. From this point forward, every SEC team, you've got a tough schedule. I don't care who you play, non-con, your schedule's going to be tough because of the teams in this league. But South Carolina, they got to play LSU and Ole Miss at home. They got to play on the road at Alabama and at Oklahoma. And then they end the year, kind of their final 5-game slate. They have games against Missouri at home and at Clemson on the road, Clemson being their arch rivals. And then, of course, you throw A&M in there as well. And A&M, still probably more talented team than South Carolina, despite maybe the turnover they've had, which we'll talk about more here in a little bit. But if you're Shane Beamer, you got 4 gimmies. You got teams like Old Dominion, Akron, Vanderbilt, who you haven't lost to since 2008, and Wofford, an in-state school that's at like the FCS level. You should win all 4 of those games. If you lose one of those games, that's a problem in and of itself. But beyond that, you've got a bunch of toss-ups. I think the one game that I think most people just flat out say, you're probably not going to win that game is Alabama just because it's Alabama. But every other game, you can make an argument for how they might be able to win. And I think Texas A&M is one of the games, where you can make the strongest argument for South Carolina finding a way to win it. So if you're Shane Beamer, the schedule dynamic might favor you here. You're playing at home. I think this is a game that you are got to win, especially when you make it back to a bowl game, which I think most Gamecock fans expect to take place this season. And since I just mentioned schedule dynamic here, Andrew, let's go ahead and dive into that aspect real quick, because the Gamecocks, look, they've got that, in my opinion, going in their favor. They got a bye week before this game against Texas A&M, and they play at Vanderbilt the week after. That's almost like a quasi-bye week, like the closest thing you can get to another bye week in the SEC. And then for A&M, you got to play LSU the week before at home, but, a little bit of a different schedule this year because of, again, like you mentioned, Texas being back on your schedule again. And then you got New Mexico State the following week. Do you think that maybe the schedule dynamic aspect of this game could play a huge factor here for South Carolina? Or do you think that, again, A&M's talent and maybe the experience Mike Elko's built up could maybe overcome that?
I think that anybody, that's played a little bit of football knows that coming off a bye week, it's great for your body. You feel healthy. You feel better. I mean, these dudes are out there, just getting bumped and bruised week and week and week. And, you get a week off. Now, there's still practice, but you get a couple days to get yourself right. And I do think that, plays a role. And I think knowing that Texas A&M is going to be playing a physical LSU football team the week before, despite it being a home game, I still think, it's definitely advantage towards South Carolina in that. But it's nice that Texas A&M gets to play New Mexico State the week after. And obviously, New Mexico State, don't forget that team walked into Jordan Hare and won last year. So you never know. But
yep.
That whole team transferred to Vandy, actually, ironically, I'm pretty sure, like the whole New Mexico State team. So it's the Vandy Aggies now. But I think that definitely it's a benefit in favor of the Gamecocks here. But I guess it's nice to know that after you get done playing on the road against South Carolina, you get to come home to play New Mexico State. I'd rather it go the way it is for Texas A&M. You got a tough game against LSU, then you go on the road, then you come home to an easier matchup. Then if it was New Mexico State, then South Carolina, then LSU. I think that kind of works out better because, LSU is going to be a really good football team. So I think it definitely favors the Gamecocks there, and I think it's definitely worth a discussion.
Yeah, and it's, by the way, it's an interesting point that you make about New Mexico State, and obviously Jerry Kill, I think, retired, or at least has left the game as far as on-field coaching is concerned. I believe he's now basically an assistant or an advisor to Clark Lee over at Vanderbilt, and you mentioned all those players. So, that Vanderbilt game, hey, who knows? For South Carolina, that might be a game maybe you can't really sleep on when this season ends up playing out here in just a couple months' time. Now, as far as Texas A&M goes, a lot of changes taken place for this program over the past few months, both in terms of the coaching staff and also as far as the roster is concerned. So what could this mean for the Aggies in 2024? We'll talk with Andrew Stefaniak about that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Aggies. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team, both faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So in essence, if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free today. Terms and conditions do apply. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks and the Locked On Aggies podcast, where we cover the South Carolina Gamecocks and Texas A&M Aggies every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks or Locked On Aggies podcast your first listen wherever you get your audio podcasts daily or your first watch on YouTube. All right, Andrew, let's talk a little bit more about the Texas A&M Aggies now going into this season, because this has definitely been an offseason of change over in College Station. And I want to start off with the roster. Obviously, quarterback last year, once again, a little bit of a revolving door, and a big reason for that was because quarterback Connor Weigman got hurt and was lost for the rest of the year about halfway through the 2023 season. Seemed to have a pretty big impact on that Aggies offense, considering the talent that Weigman possesses. So he comes back for this upcoming season in Mike Elko's first year. What do you think his return means for the Aggies this fall?
Weigman was playing great football before he got hurt. He got hurt against Auburn at home. The first 4 games of the year, he was great. Now, of course, there were the first 3 games here, of course, there were a lot of not great teams mixed in there. He played great against Miami. The secondary lost that game against Miami. The offense was wonderful. And Weigman was QBR-wise, numbers-wise, was on pace for a monster season. And then he gets the foot injury against Auburn. Season's lost. He's back. It took him a little bit longer to get healthy than we expected. There was definitely a little bit of concern during spring practice, but he's back almost to 100%, so we feel good heading into the season. He's a great player. And you got to remember, a couple games his freshman season, a couple games last year, then the injury. I don't think college football or the SEC knows who Connor Weigman is yet. And he hasn't broken out yet. So Texas A&M fans, we know who he is. Other fan bases really don't yet. And I think that as long as he stays out there on the field, he's going to have the opportunity to show the world, in SEC fans, college football fans, who he truly is. And I believe he could be a first-round pick. And that's not – it's NFL scouts agree with that. That's not just me saying something crazy to say something crazy. There's a lot of people who really do believe that. He's a great player. He hasn't had the opportunity to prove it. And as long as he's on the field, this year will be that opportunity.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I think Connor Weigman's one of the best kept secrets in all of college football. Obviously, South Carolina fans kind of feel the same way about their likely starting quarterback this upcoming fall in Lenore Sellers. So that could definitely be a really great quarterback matchup by the time this game takes place later this fall. But obviously, Andrew, we talk about football, and the thing that we always talk about, we start with quarterbacks, but you've obviously got to have pieces around them in order to have a successful year. And with Texas A&M, at least when you look at the transfer portal numbers, the turnover is definitely maybe a little bit of a concern. They lost 29 total players according to On3 Sports. That included guys like Walter Nolan on the defensive line, Evan Stewart, wide receiver, two big-time pieces right there. But they also added 27 more guys, including Alabama's Desmond Ricks, who I believe plays in the secondary or played in the secondary the past couple years for LSU and Alabama respectively. So, people would also say the culture wasn't maybe great under Jimbo Fisher. Mike Elko comes in. Maybe he's going to overhaul all that, and that was part of the reason for all this portal overhaul. So do you think this turnover will be maybe for the benefit of Texas A&M, or do you think it will hold them back a little bit in year one under Mike Elko?
I think he lost and that's part of it. Coaching turnover, you're going to lose players to the portal, especially in this new world of college football that we all know. But, he did a great job filling holes. So yes, Walter Nolan, Evan Stewart, there is no replacing those guys. Those are two top probably 50 players in all college football. Those are elite players.
Right.
Now, you replaced Walter Nolan with a guy named Nick Scorton. I don't know if that name has made its way to Columbia yet, but this guy is going to be a star. He was at Purdue last year, double-digit sacks. I think he's got a chance to be one of the best defensive players in the SEC, lead the league in sacks. He's going to be a dominant force for the Aggies. So when people say, which is true, I mean, you lost a lot, but I've heard people say you lost Walter Nolan, and I go, I think Nick Scorton's going to have a better season than Walter Nolan. Now, Walter Nolan's more of a tackle, a three technique defensive tackle than Scorton's more of a defensive end, but still, you see what I'm saying? Like impact wise, Evan Stewart, I don't have an argument here for you for replacing Evan Stewart, but you also lose Aniyah Smith to the NFL draft, which are two great receivers on this team that are now gone. But your three starting receivers were with the team last year, played a lot of snaps, did a lot well. Moose Muhammad's a guy who's been around a lot. You of course have Jay Walker back again, and then Noah Thomas back. All these guys dealt with injuries in another lineup last year, but they're great receivers if they're on the field. Once again, highly ranked guys, 4-star, 5-star type players. So the receiver room is going to be okay too. So yes, I would say this. The way that Coach Elko, the way he used the portal, I love it when coaches, they see the holes and they fill them. Sometimes you go, okay, we need a linebacker. Why'd you get a receiver? What? We need a linebacker. Everything that Texas A&M needed, Coach Elko got, and honestly got a surplus of. Secondary was a big concern. The secondary was atrocious last year. He got like 9 players in the secondary. And I joked, I'm like, you can't swing and miss 9 times. Like some of these guys got to be okay. So he did a great job of finding the holes and filling them with solid players out of the portal.
Yeah, and even if people look on paper, Andrew, and they sit there and say, well, again, like you mentioned, Walter Nolan being gone, Evan Stewart being gone, if there's one thing Mike Elko did prove in, his short time up in Durham coaching the Duke Blue Devils, it's that he could find a way to get more out of guys that maybe, again, just on paper don't seem to match up against guys that maybe are more talented than them. And so if you're an Aggie fan, I think you definitely got to take solace in that, even if it did mean that, hey, you lost a couple of your bigger pieces from Jimbo Fisher's final team that he fielded in 2023. And speaking of Mike Elko, what is it that he could do for the Aggies? Could he be the coach that finally helps Texas A&M break through what it seemingly has been a glass ceiling during their time in the SEC? Andrew will give his thoughts on that in a few moments on this crossover show between the Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Aggies podcast. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball and more, and you can bet it all right now on FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from who's going to hit one out of the park to potentially who's going to win the World Series. And right now, the odds say that, according to FanDuel, the Atlanta Braves got a pretty good shot to win it all. Their odds are currently set at plus 900. And hey, you live over in the Texas area, got a couple teams here on this list too. The Houston Astros listed at plus 2,000, got a ton of playoff experience over the past couple years. And the Texas Rangers, they're the defending champs, plus 3,000. And of course, again, you never know what postseason experience could do for clubs like that. So if you think one of those clubs could potentially win it all later this fall, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's crossover edition between the Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Aggies podcast, where we cover your teams every single day in around 30 minutes or less. All right, Andrew, one final big question for you before we end today's show. Let's talk about Mike Elko a little bit. This hire surprisingly got a little bit of a mixed reaction. I say a little bit in the literal sense. A lot of people, I think, thought that this was a great hire in terms of fit. Mike Elko, having been the defensive coordinator previously at Texas A&M, knows that program better than probably anybody else in college football, understands the SEC landscape, had some success at Duke. There were also some people that maybe pushed back and said, yeah, but Texas A&M is one of those jobs where you got to deal with a lot of people behind closed doors in terms of shaking hands, and trying to get some NIL money, maybe some more funding compared to other schools potentially in the SEC. And Mike Elko might not have the personality to deal with all of that. From a holistic standpoint, Andrew, do you think that the Aggies nailed it with this Mike Elko hire? And if so, what do you think the ceiling is for Texas A&M in the near future?
I'll be brutally honest. At first, I did not. I was not, I went, if you're paying Jimbo Fisher, what was it, $75 million to leave?
Something like that. Yeah.
I figured you were going to do something a little bit more substantial than Mike Elko. Now, you could take the other hand there and go, well, you're paying him $75 million. How are you going to pay a coach? But beside the point, still, if you're saying, hey, you're leaving, kind of like, I guess you could make the LSU comparison. You tell Ed Orgeron to kick rocks and you go get Brian Kelly. Like, I thought it was going to be more of a splash higher than it was. And so at first I went, and then I dug more and into Elko. I obviously knew who Elko was, but, because he was the DC, but dug more into him, how he'd been doing at Duke. And I loved everything I saw. But then I was like, I still got to see it here. I got to see recruiting. He has done a really good job recruiting the high school. Obviously, the portal, he did great. But right now, Texas A&M's class is sitting at number 8, I believe, and he's ahead of pace from where Jimbo Fisher was last year this time. He's recruiting really well. He went and hired Colin Klein as his offensive coordinator, of course, with Elko being a defensive guy. And Colin Klein, I'll tell you this right now, he'll be a power 4 now, a power 4 head coach within 2 or 3 years. He's a star in the making. He's going to be, which I hate because I wish he would just stay at Texas A&M, but he is a great coach. He was a great hire. So, I really want, and that's why I wanted to say my initial reaction to the hire, because I want everyone to understand, like, I have taken a 360 on this. I believe Coach Elko is going to succeed. I think the ceiling, the X's and O's are there, for Coach, right now for Coach Elko. He knows all that. The question has all been, can he recruit? Can he get those players that Jimbo Fisher was getting, but then not really developing? And as of right now, he's getting those players. And I believe he's going to be able to develop them better than the previous regime. So I went from, and I'm not saying I was, Elko's going to fail, he's going to be awful. I'm not saying I was all out, but I'm saying I went from, we'll see, to a full-on believer in this hire and where Coach Elko, I think the culture's great. I think he's done a great job so far, and I think he's going to be an elite coach at Texas A&M. So ceiling-wise, it's hard to sit here and say, I believe, I'll say this. I believe within 3 to 5 years, he will get Texas A&M to a 12-team playoff, which, is not, I don't know how much that's saying, but still, I believe in 3 to 5 years, he will get the job done once.
Yeah, and Andrew, it's funny because Mike Elko actually, it doesn't seem like he was the very first option out the gates. Obviously, it seems like they were this close. Obviously, if you're watching on YouTube or you're listening to an audio podcast app, I got my index finger and my thumb literally almost touching each other. They were that close to hiring Mark Stoops away from Kentucky. Then fans got wind of it. It leaked out a little bit, maybe earlier than they wanted to, and there was an uproar, massive uproar. Quite frankly, I kind of agree with it because I think Mark Stoops is kind of in the twilight stage of his football career at this point. But with Mike Elko, I think the thought process was pretty simple. Hey, we got all the resources that any program would almost kill to have in terms of money, in terms of alumni support and the like. All we got to do is get a guy that just understands all the football stuff way better than any of us could combined. And Mike Elko, I think, as you mentioned, he has proven in his short time as a head coach, like, hey, player development, that ain't going to be a problem for him. In terms of culture, blue-collar mentality, it fits the background of Texas A&M a great deal, going back to the history that program seems to have. So, yeah, I'm with you. When they made that hire, I think I'm pretty sure I tweeted out, this is an A-plus hire for Texas A&M. So it would not stun me at all if Elko is finally the guy that takes Texas A&M all the way to a playoff, and who knows, maybe he has them competing for a national championship here in the very near future. He is Andrew Stefaniak of the Locked On Aggies podcast. Andrew, I really appreciate you coming on to today's show once again. For all the work that you do on the Aggies and maybe any other teams in the SEC, where can Gamecock fans find you?
Yeah, you can check out everything I got going on over at Locked On Aggies. Same where you can find me on all your podcast platforms and on YouTube before this game happens. If you want to check out what we got going on over there, you're more than welcome to do so. But good luck to Gamecock fans this year.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting game between the Aggies and Gamecocks when that matchup takes place. But with all that being said, thank you to all of you Gamecock and Aggie fans for listening to today's show or watching today's show, of course. Have a great rest of your day. We'll be sure to catch you on our next respective shows of the Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Aggies podcast.